There is a corridor in a temple in Upper Egypt that contains the names of 76 pharaohs, carved in 3 neat rows of cartouches on a limestone wall. The list begins with Menes, the legendary king who unified Upper and Lower Egypt around 3100 BC, and ends with Seti I, the 19th dynasty pharaoh who commissioned the wall. Between Menes and Seti, the list records the names of every pharaoh that Seti considered legitimate. Every king whose memory deserved to be preserved, whose reign deserved to be honored, whose existence deserved to be acknowledged in the most sacred temple in Egypt. But the list is a lie, not a complete lie. The names on the wall are real, and most of the pharaohs listed did exist. But the list is selective, deliberately, systematically, politically selective. Hatshepsut, the woman who ruled as pharaoh for 20 years, is absent. Akhenaten, the heretic who abolished the worship of Ammon, is absent. Tutankhamun, the boy king who restored the old religion, is absent. Smenkhkare, I, the rulers who bridged the gap between the Amarna period and the 19th dynasty, all absent. The list does not merely omit these pharaohs. It denies their existence. It closes the gap they occupied. It sutures the wound they left in the dynastic record, creating a seamless narrative of male, orthodox, divinely sanctioned kingship that flows from Menes to Seti without interruption, without deviation, without a single awkward reign. This is the Abydos King List, and it is carved on the wall of a temple that contains, by the consensus of virtually every Egyptologist who has studied it, the finest carved reliefs in all of Egypt. The Temple of Seti I at Abydos is not the largest Egyptian temple. It is not the best preserved. It is not the most famous. But it is, in the judgment of scholars who have spent their lives studying Egyptian art, the most beautiful. The raised reliefs that cover its interior walls, scenes of the pharaoh making offerings to the gods, performing rituals, receiving divine blessings, are carved with a delicacy, a precision, and an emotional depth that no other Egyptian temple matches. The figures are not merely correct. They are alive, their limbs articulated, their garments flowing, their expressions conveying a serenity that seems to transcend the stone from which they are carved. The reliefs of Seti I at Abydos are the Sistine Chapel of ancient Egyptian art, the pinnacle of a 3,000-year artistic tradition, produced at the moment of its greatest refinement in the temple of a pharaoh who understood that beauty was the most powerful form of devotion. By the end of tonight, you're going to understand why Seti I built his most important temple not at Thebes, where his dynasty was based, but at Abydos, 300 kilometers to the north, in a city that had been sacred for 3,000 years. You're going to understand the Abydos King List, why certain pharaohs were included and why others were erased. You're going to understand the Osirion, the mysterious megalithic structure buried behind the temple, whose purpose and age are still debated. And you're going to understand why Abydos itself, the city, the cemetery, the pilgrimage center, was the spiritual heart of ancient Egypt for longer than any other site in the Nile Valley. Before we get started, if you find these mysteries as fascinating as we do, take a second to like the video or subscribe. It's a simple action, but it helps this channel reach more curious minds like yours. Now, let's begin. To understand the Temple of Seti I, begin with Abydos itself, because at Abydos, the site is older than the temple, the tradition is older than the site, and the sacredness is older than the tradition. Abydos is one of the most ancient sacred sites in Egypt, arguably the most ancient. Located in Upper Egypt, roughly 160 kilometers north of Luxor and 10 kilometers from the Nile, the site has been continuously used for religious purposes since the predynastic period. Before the unification of Egypt, before the first pharaoh, before the invention of hieroglyphic writing, the earliest burials at Abydos date to roughly 3400 BC. Small, brick-lined graves containing the bodies of local leaders, accompanied by pottery, stone vessels, and simple grave goods. These early burials established Abydos as a cemetery, a place where the dead were laid to rest, a threshold between the world of the living and the world of the dead. The first dynasty pharaohs, the kings who unified Egypt and established the pharaonic state around 3100 BC, chose Abydos as their royal burial ground. The cemetery known as el-Kab, the Mother of Pots, located in the desert behind the cultivation, contains the tombs of the first pharaohs of unified Egypt, Nama, Aha, Jet, Den, and their successors. These tombs were not pyramids. They were underground chambers, rectangular pits, lined with mud brick, roofed with timber, and filled with grave goods that included furniture, food, weapons, and, in the earliest cases, the bodies of sacrificed retainers, servants, courtiers, and women who were killed and buried alongside their king to serve him in the afterlife. The association with the earliest kings gave Abydos a prestige that no other site could match. Abydos was where Egypt began. Abydos was where the first pharaohs were buried. Abydos was the original royal cemetery, the place that predated Saqqara, that predated Giza, that predated the Valley of the Kings. And the prestige of antiquity, the power of being first, sustained Abydos's sacred status for 3,000 years after the last First Dynasty king was buried there. But the association that truly defined Abydos was not with the early pharaohs. It was with Osiris, the god of the dead, the ruler of the underworld, the deity whose worship was the most widespread and the most emotionally powerful in the entire Egyptian pantheon. Sometime during the Middle Kingdom, roughly 2100 to 1700 BC, the tomb of the first dynasty pharaoh Jer was identified as the burial place of Osiris himself. The identification was probably not historically accurate. Djer was a human king, not a god. But the Egyptians did not make the modern distinction between historical fact and theological truth. If the tomb was identified as Osiris's, then Osiris was buried there. The identification was, for all practical purposes, a fact. The consequence of this identification was transformative. Abydos became the holiest site in Egypt, the place where the god of the dead was buried, the threshold of the underworld, the gateway through which the deceased passed on their journey to the afterlife. Pilgrims came from across Egypt to visit the tomb of Osiris, to leave offerings, to erect stelae, and to participate in the annual Mysteries of Osiris, a multi-day festival that reenacted the death, burial, and resurrection of the god in a public spectacle of mourning and celebration that was the most important religious event in the Egyptian calendar. The pilgrimage to Abydos was so important that Egyptians who could not make the journey in person included references to Abydos in their tomb inscriptions, asking, in their funerary prayers, to make the journey to Abydos after death, to visit the tomb of Osiris, to participate in the mysteries from the other side of the grave. The journey to Abydos was not merely a tourist trip, it was a spiritual necessity, an essential component of the afterlife journey that every Egyptian hoped to make. It was in this sacred context that Seti I chose to build his mortuary temple. Seti was the second pharaoh of the 19th dynasty, the son of Ramesses I, the father of Ramesses II. He ruled for roughly 15 years, from about 1290 to 1279 BC. His reign was a period of restoration, the restoration of Egyptian power after the dislocations of the Amarna period, the restoration of the traditional cults after Akhenaten's heresy, and the restoration of the dynastic record after the confused succession that had followed Akhenaten's death. Seti's choice of Abydos for his mortuary temple was itself an act of restoration. By building at Abydos, the oldest and most sacred site in Egypt, Seti was connecting his dynasty to the deepest roots of Egyptian tradition. He was saying, "I am not merely the son of Ramesses I, I am the heir of Menes. I am the heir of the first dynasty kings who are buried here. My dynasty does not begin with my father. It begins at the beginning, at Abydos, where Egypt began, where Osiris is buried, where the pharaonic tradition has its oldest and deepest roots, the annual Mysteries of Osiris, the festival that made Abydos the most important pilgrimage center in ancient Egypt, was a multi-day event that reenacted the central narrative of Egyptian religion, the death, burial, and resurrection of the god Osiris. The festival, described in several ancient texts and depicted in reliefs at multiple temples, involved a public procession from the Temple of Osiris at Abydos to the tomb of the god at el-Ka'ab, a journey of roughly 2 kilometers through the desert. The procession was led by a statue of Wetpowet, the jackal god, the opener of the ways, who cleared the path for Osiris. Behind the jackal came the sacred bark of Osiris, carried by priests, accompanied by musicians, followed by thousands of pilgrims who had travelled from across Egypt to participate in the ceremony. The procession included a staged battle, a ritual combat between the forces of Horus, the protector of Osiris, and the forces of Seth, the murderer of Osiris. The battle was not merely symbolic. It involved real weapons, clubs, staves, and shields. And the participants, who represented the two sides of the cosmic conflict, fought with sufficient vigor to produce genuine injuries. Ancient accounts describe the battle as chaotic, violent, and emotionally intense, a cathartic experience in which the participants released their grief for the murdered god through physical combat. At the tomb, the presumed burial place of Osiris at el-Kab, the rituals of burial and resurrection were performed. The sacred bark was placed in the tomb, the mourning rituals were enacted, and then, on the final day of the festival, the bark was brought forth from the tomb, resurrected, reborn, triumphant over death. The emergence of the bark from the tomb was the climax of the mysteries, the moment when death was defeated, when the god was restored to life, when the cosmic order was renewed. The crowd that witnessed the emergence erupted in celebration, singing, dancing, feasting, rejoicing in the triumph of life over death. The mysteries were not merely a spectacle, they were a sacrament, a ritual in which the participants experienced, through their physical involvement in the drama, the death and resurrection of the god. The pilgrim, who participated in the mysteries, did not merely watch the resurrection. The pilgrim experienced it, felt the grief of the death, felt the violence of the battle, felt the joy of the resurrection. The experience was understood to be spiritually transformative, to prepare the pilgrim for their own death and resurrection, to guarantee their passage through the underworld, to ensure their eternal life in the company of Osiris. The stelae that pilgrims left at Abydos, hundreds of them, discovered by archaeologists in the area surrounding the temple, are the material record of this pilgrimage tradition. The stelae are inscribed with the names, titles, and prayers of the pilgrims, men and women who had travelled to Abydos, who had participated in the mysteries, and who wished to maintain a permanent presence at the holiest site in Egypt. The stelae are, in effect, ancient postcards, personal messages carved in stone, left by individuals who wanted the gods to know that they had been there, that they had participated, that they had earned the right to be remembered at the threshold of the underworld. The pilgrimage tradition at Abydos lasted for more than 2,000 years, from the Middle Kingdom to the Roman period. During that time, hundreds of thousands of pilgrims visited the site, left their stelae, and participated in the mysteries. The archaeological evidence for this pilgrimage, the stelae, the offering deposits, the makeshift chapels and cenotaphs that pilgrims built in the area surrounding the temple, is among the most extensive evidence for religious pilgrimage in the ancient world. Abydos was, for ancient Egypt, what Mecca is for Islam, what Jerusalem is for Christianity and Judaism, what Varanasi is for Hinduism, the most sacred destination, the most essential journey, the one pilgrimage that every believer hoped to make before death. Seti I, by building his mortuary temple at Abydos, was inserting himself into this pilgrimage tradition. His temple was not merely a personal monument, it was a way station on the pilgrim's journey, a building that the pilgrims would pass on their way to the tomb of Osiris, a structure that would house the rituals that Seti's priests performed as part of the mysteries. The temple was designed to be seen by the pilgrims, to be entered by the pilgrims, to be experienced as part of the Abydos pilgrimage, and the reliefs, the exquisite, politically motivated, theologically loaded reliefs, were the message that the pilgrims received. The message was, Seti is the legitimate king. Seti serves the gods. Seti belongs here, at Abydos, among the ancestors, in the company of Osiris. The message was delivered in the finest artistic language that the 19th dynasty could produce, and the language of raised relief, of modelled surfaces, of flowing garments and composed expressions, was so beautiful that the message it carried became almost invisible. The pilgrims saw the beauty, they felt the devotion, they experienced the spiritual power of the images, and they accepted the political message, the legitimacy claim, the dynastic assertion, the self-serving genealogy of the King List, as a natural and inevitable consequence of the beauty that conveyed it. The art made the politics disappear, the beauty made the propaganda invisible, and the temple, the most beautiful temple in Egypt, became, through its beauty, the most effective political monument of the 19th dynasty. Seti I's reign, though relatively brief at roughly 15 years, was one of the most consequential in the New Kingdom. He inherited a kingdom that was still recovering from the disruptions of the Amarna period and the confused succession that followed. The economy had been weakened by Akhenaten's neglect of the empire. The military had been weakened by the loss of territories in Syria and Palestine. The priesthood of Amun had been humiliated by the Atonist heresy and was demanding compensation in the form of renewed royal patronage. And the population, which had experienced 2 decades of religious upheaval and political instability, was looking for reassurance, for a pharaoh who would restore the old order, rebuild the old temples, and resume the old rituals that had been disrupted by the heretical king. Seti provided this reassurance, with a combination of military action, religious restoration, and artistic patronage that was, in its scope and its effectiveness, unmatched by any pharaoh since Thutmose III. He campaigned in Syria and Palestine, recovering territories that had been lost during the Amarna period and reasserting Egyptian authority over the Levantine client states. He campaigned in Libya, securing the western frontier against tribal incursions, and he launched the construction program that would define his legacy, the Temple of Abydos, the hypostyle hall at Karnak, which he began and which his son Ramesses would complete, and a mortuary temple on the west bank of Thebes. The artistic quality of Seti's building program was deliberate. It was not merely a product of the available craftsmen. It was a policy, a conscious decision to invest the highest levels of artistic skill in the decoration of the buildings that would carry the dynastic message. Seti's architects and sculptors were given the resources, the time, and the creative latitude to produce work of exceptional quality. The result was a body of art that served the political purpose of legitimacy, not through bombast, not through the colossal statues and the grandiose self-promotion that would characterize his son, Ramesses' reign, but through refinement. Seti's art says, "I am legitimate because I am beautiful. I am divine because my temples are exquisite. The gods endorse me because the work I offer them is worthy of their acceptance." The strategy of legitimacy through beauty was innovative. Previous pharaohs had established their legitimacy through military conquest, through the construction of massive monuments, through the display of wealth and power. Seti did all of these things as well, but his primary legitimacy strategy was artistic. The production of temple decoration so fine, so refined that it technically accomplished, in itself, evidence of divine favor. Only a legitimate king, the reasoning went, could produce art of such quality. Only a pharaoh, endorsed by the gods, could command the skills necessary to create the Abydos reliefs. The beauty was the proof, the art was the argument, and the argument was carved in limestone on the walls of the most sacred temple in Egypt for all to see. The choice of white limestone for the temple's construction was itself a quality decision. Sandstone, the standard building material for Upper Egyptian temples, was abundant, cheap, and easy to quarry. Limestone was rarer, more expensive, and more difficult to work. But limestone was also finer. Its grain was smoother, its texture was more uniform, its response to the chisel was more precise. The choice of limestone over sandstone was a choice of quality over economy, a declaration that the Temple of Abydos would be built from the finest available material, regardless of cost. The L-shaped plan of the temple, unique in Egyptian architecture, was a product of the site's geography and the temple's theological program. The main axis of the temple runs east to west, from the entrance through the 2 hypostyle halls to the 7 chapels. A secondary axis runs south from the second hypostyle hall, leading to the Gallery of the Ancestors, where the King List is carved, the Hall of Barks, and the southern chapels dedicated to Ptah, Nefertem, and other deities. The 2 axes create the distinctive L shape that distinguishes the temple from every other Egyptian temple, a shape that reflects the dual function of the building, which served simultaneously as a mortuary temple for Seti, the east-west axis, and as a cult center for Osiris and the associated funerary deities, the north-south axis. The 7-chapel arrangement, the 7 parallel sanctuaries that open from the back of the second hypostyle hall, is the most distinctive architectural feature of the temple, and the one that has generated the most scholarly discussion. No other Egyptian temple has 7 parallel chapels. The standard temple has a single sanctuary. The double temple at Komombo has 2. The 7 at Abydos are unprecedented, a theological statement of extraordinary ambition, placing the pharaoh at the center of a divine network that encompasses the most important deities of the Egyptian pantheon, the choice of which 7 deities to include was itself significant. The 7, Seti himself, Ptah, Ra-Harati, Amun-Ra, Osiris, Isis and Horus, represent the major theological constituencies of the Egyptian state. Amun-Ra represents the Theban establishment, the powerful priesthood that had been humiliated by Akhenaten and that the 19th dynasty was committed to restoring. Ptah represents the Memphite tradition, the ancient theological school based at Memphis, the traditional administrative capital of Egypt. Ra-Horakhti represents the Heliopolitan tradition, the solar theology based at Heliopolis, the oldest theological school in Egypt. And Osiris, Isis and Horus represent the Abydos tradition, the funerary theology that made Abydos the holiest site in Egypt. By including all of these traditions in a single temple, Seti was making a comprehensive claim, a claim to represent not merely one theological school but all of them, not merely one region but all of Egypt, not merely one aspect of the divine but the full spectrum of Egyptian theology. The claim was audacious, but it was also effective. The 7-chapel temple at Abydos became one of the most admired buildings in Egypt, visited by pilgrims, studied by scholars, and revered by subsequent pharaohs who recognized the building as a masterpiece of both architecture and theology. Ramesses II, who completed the temple after Seti's death, built his own temple nearby, a smaller, less refined, less ambitious building that paid homage to his father's creation without attempting to rival it. The son recognized the father's achievement, the warrior deferred to the artist, and the Temple of Abydos, completed in the early years of Ramesses' reign, took its place as the most beautiful building in the most sacred city in Egypt. The core problem of the Temple of Seti I at Abydos is the problem of legitimacy, the problem of a new dynasty that needed to establish its credentials in a culture where authority derived from the past. The 19th dynasty was new. Seti's father, Ramesses I, was not a prince. He was a military officer, a general, a vizier, a man who had risen through the ranks of the army and the administration to become the most powerful official in Egypt. He was appointed co-regent by the aging pharaoh Horemheb, who had no surviving heir, and he succeeded Horemheb on the throne. The transition was smooth. There was no civil war, no contested succession, no violence, but the legitimacy was thin. Ramesses I was not of royal blood. His family had no connection to the ancient royal lineages. His claim to the throne rested on appointment, not on inheritance, on the will of one man, not on the will of the gods. Seti inherited this legitimacy problem. His father had ruled for only 2 years before dying. The dynasty was barely established. The memory of the Amarna period, of Akhenaten's heresy, of the confused succession that followed, of the break in the orderly transfer of power from father to son, was still fresh, and the priesthood of Amun, which had been restored to power after the Amarna period, was watching the new dynasty closely, assessing its commitment to the traditional religion, evaluating its worthiness to sit on the throne of Horus. The Temple of Abydos was Seti's response to this scrutiny. The building was designed to accomplish 3 objectives simultaneously. First, it was a mortuary temple, a place where the cult of the deceased Seti would be maintained after his death, where offerings would be made, where his ka would be sustained for eternity. Second, it was a temple of Osiris, a place where the rituals of the most important god in the Egyptian afterlife would be performed, linking Seti's cult to the most powerful and most emotionally resonant deity in the Egyptian pantheon. And third, it was a political statement, a declaration of dynastic legitimacy, expressed through architecture, through art, and through the Abydos King List, which connected Seti's dynasty to every legitimate pharaoh from Menes to the present. The King List was the most explicit element of this political program. Carved on the wall of a corridor connecting the second hypostyle hall to the southern extension of the temple, The list consists of 3 rows of cartouches, 76 names, beginning with Menes and ending with Seti, arranged in chronological order, with the figure of Seti and the young prince Rameses, the future Rameses II, shown making offerings to the assembled ancestors. The scene is simultaneously an act of worship and an act of political self-promotion. Seti is not merely honoring his predecessors, he is placing himself among them, asserting his right to stand in their company, to inherit their legacy, to continue the unbroken chain of divine kingship that stretches back to the founding of the Egyptian state. But the chain is not unbroken. The list omits at least 6 pharaohs whose reigns fell between the 18th and the 19th dynasties: Hatshepsut, Akhenaten, Smenkhare, Tutankhamun I, and possibly others. The omissions are not accidental. They are deliberate. A systematic erasure of the pharaohs whose reigns were considered illegitimate, heretical, or otherwise incompatible with the narrative of orderly succession that the list was designed to project. And it gets worse. The omission of these pharaohs from the king list is not merely a political convenience, it is a theological act. In Egyptian thought, a person's existence in the afterlife depended on the preservation of their name. To erase a name was to erase a person, to deny them the afterlife, to condemn them to the second death, the permanent death from which there was no return. The Abydos King List does not merely omit the Amarna pharaohs from the historical record. It condemns them to oblivion, to the theological annihilation that was, in Egyptian belief, the worst fate that could befall a human being. The irony is that the King List, which was designed to establish Seti's legitimacy by connecting him to the past, has become one of the most important historical documents in Egyptology, not because of the names it includes, but because of the names it omits. The gaps in the list are as informative as the entries. They tell us which pharaohs the 19th dynasty considered illegitimate. They tell us which reigns were considered heretical. They tell us which rulers were subjected to the theological punishment of name erasure. The King List is a document of inclusion and exclusion, a curated history, a selective memory, a political genealogy carved in stone. And the selectivity, the deliberate, systematic, theologically motivated choice of which pharaohs to remember and which to forget is the most revealing thing about it. The Abydos King List was first documented by the English traveller and antiquarian William John Bankes in 1818. 4 years before Champollion's decipherment of the hieroglyphs made cartouches readable, Bankes, who recognised the significance of the list but could not yet read the names, made careful drawings that were later used by Champollion and other early Egyptologists to reconstruct the sequence of Egyptian pharaohs. The list, combined with similar but less complete lists from other temples, including the Kant King List, the Saqqara King List, and the Turin Royal Canon, provided the framework for the chronological structure of Egyptian history that scholars use to this day. The omissions from the Abydos King List have been the subject of intense scholarly analysis. The 6 or more pharaohs who are absent from the list, Hatshepsut, Smenkhare, Tutankhamun I, and possibly Neferuaten, share a common characteristic: their reigns fell during the period of the 18th dynasty that the 19th dynasty considered problematic. Hatshepsut was a woman who ruled as pharaoh, an anomaly in the male-centric ideology of Egyptian kingship. Akhenaten was a heretic who abolished the worship of Amun and attempted to replace the traditional polytheistic religion with the exclusive worship of the Aten. Tutankhamun and I were associated with the restoration of the Amun cult after Akhenaten's death, but were apparently considered tainted by their connection to the Amarna period, and Smenkhare, a shadowy figure whose identity and reign are still debated by scholars, may have been connected to Akhenaten in ways that the 19th dynasty found unacceptable. The omission of Hatshepsut is particularly significant because it demonstrates that the erasure of the female pharaoh, which is usually attributed to Thutmose III, her immediate successor, was still operative more than a century and a half later, under the 19th dynasty. Hatshepsut was not merely erased from her own monuments, she was erased from the official record of Egyptian history, removed from the king lists, excluded from the genealogies, denied the eternal existence that the preservation of her name was supposed to guarantee. The erasure was comprehensive, it was institutional, and it was maintained across multiple dynasties and multiple centuries. The omission of Akhenaten and the Amarna pharaohs is more complex. Akhenaten's revolution, the abolition of the Amun cults, the closure of the traditional temples, the relocation of the capital to Amarna had been reversed within a generation of his death. The traditional religion had been restored, the temples had been reopened, the worship of Amun had been resumed, but the memory of the revolution was still painful. And the 19th dynasty, which owed its legitimacy to the restoration of the traditional order, had every reason to erase the pharaohs whose reigns had disrupted it. By omitting Akhenaten, Tutankhamun, and I from the king list, Seti was not merely sanitizing the historical record, he was eliminating the precedent. The demonstration that an Egyptian pharaoh could in fact abolish the traditional religion, close the temples, and redirect the resources of the state toward a new theological program. The precedent was dangerous, the omission was preventive. The helicopter hieroglyphs, the palimpsest inscription on a lintel in the first hypostyle hall that has been misinterpreted by alternative theorists as a depiction of modern machinery, is one of the most widely discussed features of the temple and one of the most thoroughly explained. The hieroglyphs are the result of a standard Egyptian practice called palimpsest, the recarving of an inscription on a surface that already bears an earlier inscription. In this case, the original inscription, carved during Seti's reign, read "He who repulses the 9 enemies of Egypt," one of Seti's royal titles. When Ramesses II completed the temple after Seti's death, his craftsmen plastered over the original inscription and recarved the surface with Ramesses's title, "He who protects Egypt and overthrows the foreign countries." Over the centuries, the plaster has eroded, partially revealing both inscriptions, the original and the overwriting, simultaneously. The overlapping hieroglyphs create shapes that, to a modern eye looking for familiar forms, bear a vague resemblance to a helicopter, a submarine, a tank, and a spaceship. The resemblance is accidental. It is a product of pareidolia, the psychological tendency to perceive meaningful patterns in random or ambiguous visual stimuli. The same tendency that makes us see faces in clouds and animals in rock formations makes us see helicopters in overlapping hieroglyphs. The Egyptological explanation for the shapes, palimpsest, 2 overlapping inscriptions, erosion of the intervening plaster, is well documented, easily verified, and universally accepted by scholars. The alternative explanation, that the ancient Egyptians had access to helicopters, submarines, and tanks, and chose to depict them on a lintel in a mortuary temple, is not supported by any archaeological evidence, and is contradicted by everything we know about Egyptian technology, Egyptian art, and Egyptian temple decoration. But the controversy has been useful in one respect. It has drawn public attention to the Temple of Seti I at Abydos, a temple that deserves to be far better known than it is. The helicopter hieroglyphs are not evidence of ancient technology, but they are evidence of the public's hunger for ancient mysteries, and the Temple of Abydos, with its king list, its Osirion, its exquisite reliefs, and its role in the pilgrimage traditions of ancient Egypt, has genuine mysteries enough without the need for invented ones. The cemetery of el-Kab, the Mother of Pots, named for the vast quantities of broken pottery that litter its surface, is located roughly 2 kilometers behind the Temple of Seti, in the low desert at the foot of the limestone cliffs. The cemetery contains the tombs of the First Dynasty pharaohs, the earliest kings of unified Egypt, the founders of the pharaonic tradition that would endure for 3 millennia. The tombs are modest by later standards. Rectangular pits, lined with mud brick, originally roofed with timber and matting. But they are immensely significant. The earliest royal burials in the Nile Valley, the first monuments of the first dynasty of the first civilization to emerge in the Nile Valley. The excavation of el-Kab by Flinders Petrie in the 1890s was one of the foundational events of Egyptian archaeology. Petrie, who was the pioneer of systematic archaeological methodology in Egypt, meticulously documented the tombs, recording the position of every object, the condition of every wall, the layout of every chamber. His publications, which remain the standard reference for the early dynastic period established the chronological framework for the first and second dynasties, and provided the first detailed picture of the material culture of the earliest Egyptian state. The first dynasty tombs at el-Kawab contained evidence of a practice that has haunted Egyptologists since its discovery: retainer sacrifice. The tombs of the earliest pharaohs, Aha, Djedjet, Den, and Queen Mernith, were surrounded by subsidiary graves containing the bodies of individuals who appear to have been killed and buried at the time of the king's funeral. The number of subsidiary burials varies. The tomb of Djer, the largest, is surrounded by more than 300 subsidiary graves. The individuals buried in these graves include men and women of various ages, some with evidence of violent death, others without obvious cause of death. The archaeological evidence suggests that they were retainers, servants, attendants, courtiers, who were killed to accompany the king into the afterlife. The practice of retainer sacrifice was abandoned after the first dynasty, replaced by the less lethal practice of depositing shabti figurines, small statuettes that were believed to serve the deceased in the afterlife, in the tomb. The abandonment of human sacrifice in favor of symbolic substitutions represents one of the most significant ethical transitions in early Egyptian history, a moment when the civilization decided that the afterlife could be served by representations rather than by actual human beings, that the symbolic death of a figurine was equivalent to the actual death of a servant. The identification of the tomb of Djer as the burial place of Osiris, which occurred during the Middle Kingdom, roughly 1,000 years after Djer's actual burial, transformed el-Kab from a historical cemetery into a mythological landscape. The tomb of Djer became the tomb of Osiris. The cemetery became the threshold of the underworld, and the pilgrims who visited Abydos, the thousands who came each year to participate in the mysteries, were visiting not merely a historical site but a cosmic gateway, a place where the boundary between the living and the dead was thinnest, where the passage from this world to the next could be felt, sensed, experienced in the dry desert air and the broken pottery and the silence of the tombs. The pottery that gives el-Kab its name is itself evidence of the pilgrimage tradition. The broken vessels, millions of them, covering the surface of the cemetery to a depth of several centimeters in places, are the remains of offerings left by pilgrims over centuries. Each vessel contained a libation, water, wine, or oil, poured out on the ground as an offering to the dead, to Osiris, to the ancestors buried beneath. Each broken pot is a prayer, a physical expression of devotion, left by a pilgrim who had travelled to Abydos, who had participated in the mysteries, and who had left behind a fragment of pottery as evidence of their visit and their faith. The sheer quantity of pottery at el-Kab is staggering. The site has been described as the densest deposit of ancient pottery in the world, a field of broken vessels stretching across the desert surface, covering an area of several hectares, representing the accumulated offerings of hundreds of thousands of pilgrims over a period of more than 2,000 years. The pottery is, in physical terms, the material record of the pilgrimage tradition, the tangible evidence of the faith that made Abydos the holiest site in Egypt, that sustained the mysteries for 2 millennia, and that drew pilgrims from across the Nile Valley to the cemetery of the earliest kings. Seti I, by building his temple at Abydos and connecting it to this ancient pilgrimage tradition, was performing an act of extraordinary political and theological ambition. He was not merely building a mortuary temple, he was inserting his dynasty into the deepest and most sacred narrative of Egyptian civilization, the narrative that began with the first kings at el-Kab, that was transformed by the identification of Djer's tomb with the burial of Osiris, that was sustained by the pilgrimage tradition for 2 millennia, and that culminated in Seti's self-conception in his own reign, the reign that restored the old order, rebuilt the old temples, and reconnected the pharaonic tradition to its most ancient roots. The King List is the architectural expression of this reconnection. The 76 names on the wall, beginning with Menes and ending with Set, are not merely a chronological record. They are a theological genealogy, a chain of divine succession that links Seti to the founding of the Egyptian state, that places him in a line of descent that stretches back to the beginning of recorded history. that makes him the heir not merely of his father Ramesses I, but of Menes, of Jer, of Den, of every legitimate king who ever sat on the throne of Horus. The chain is selective, the chain is curated. The chain omits the pharaohs that Seti considered illegitimate, but the chain, for all its omissions, is effective. It connects Seti to the beginning. It places him in the company of the founders, and it declares, in carved limestone on the wall of the most sacred temple in Egypt, that the 19th dynasty is not new. It is ancient. It is legitimate. It is the continuation of a tradition that is as old as Egypt itself. Walk through the Temple of Seti I as a visitor would, from the ruined exterior to the exquisite interior, from the bright upper Egyptian sunlight into the dim, cool, limestone-walled chambers where the finest reliefs in Egypt wait in the silence. The exterior of the temple is largely ruined. The two pylons that originally fronted the building have collapsed. The outer courts have lost their walls. The portico, the columned entrance hall, is roofless. The sandstone surfaces that face the exterior have weathered badly, their reliefs softened by millennia of wind, sand, and the occasional flash flood that sweeps through the low desert at Abydos. The exterior of the temple is, by Egyptian standards, unremarkable, damaged, deteriorated, disappointing to the visitor who has come expecting the visual splendor of Karnak or Edfu. But the interior is a revelation. Cross the threshold and the world changes. The sandstone gives way to fine white limestone, a material that is softer, smoother, and more responsive to the chisel than the sandstone of the exterior. The light dims, the air cools. The noise of the outside world, the wind, the birds, the distant barking of dogs, recedes, and the reliefs emerge from the dimness, figures of gods and kings, carved in the raised relief technique that is Seti's artistic signature, their surfaces catching the faint light, their outlines sharp, their details exquisite. The first hypostyle hall, the outer hall, completed by Ramesses II after Seti's death, contains 24 papyrus columns arranged in 2 rows of 12. The reliefs in this hall are Ramesses's work, carved in the sunk relief technique that Ramesses favoured, bolder and more dramatic than Seti's raised relief, but recognizably less refined. The difference between the two styles is immediately visible. Ramesses's figures are larger, more forceful, more propagandistic. Seti's figures are smaller, more delicate, more spiritually intense. The transition from Ramesses's hall to Seti's hall is a transition from power to beauty, from the art of a warrior king to the art of a mystic. The second hypostyle hall is Seti's. 36 columns, arranged in 3 rows of 12, support a ceiling that retains traces of its original astronomical decoration. Golden stars on a blue background, the standard Egyptian representation of the night sky. The walls and the columns are covered with the raised reliefs that have made Seti's temple famous. Scenes of the pharaoh in communion with the gods, performing the rituals of divine service, receiving blessings and bestowing offerings. The quality of the carving is extraordinary. Each figure is modelled with a sensitivity to the human form that is rare in Egyptian art. The muscles of the arms are articulated. The folds of the garments are rendered. The expressions on the faces, the calm, composed, inward-looking expressions of gods and kings in the act of worship, are carved with a subtlety that makes the viewer feel not that they are looking at a stone carving, but that they are watching a ritual in progress. Beyond the second hypostyle hall lie the 7 chapels, the sanctuaries that give the temple its unique architectural character. The 7 chapels are arranged in a row across the back of the second hall, their doorways opening like the pipes of an organ along the rear wall. Each chapel is dedicated to a different deity. From left to right, the deified Seti I, Ptah, Ra-Harakti, Amun-Ra, Osiris, Isis, and Horus. Each chapel is vaulted, its ceiling a curved corbelled arch, decorated with golden stars on a blue background, creating a celestial dome above each divine resident. Each chapel is decorated with reliefs showing Seti performing the daily ritual for the chapel's specific deity, washing the statue, anointing it, dressing it, presenting offerings, reciting hymns. The 7-chapel plan is unique. No other Egyptian temple has this arrangement. The standard Egyptian temple has a single sanctuary, 1 room, 1 god, 1 shrine. Seti's temple has seven rooms, 7 gods, 7 shrines, 7 sets of rituals, 7 parallel theological programs, all housed under one roof. The design is extraordinary in its ambition. It places the pharaoh at the center of a divine network, surrounded by the most important gods of the Egyptian pantheon, serving each of them simultaneously through maintaining the cosmic order through the comprehensive performance of multiple parallel rituals. The Osiris Chapel, the fifth from the left, leads to the Osiris Complex, a suite of additional chambers dedicated to the different forms of Osiris and to the associated deities Isis and Horus. The Osiris Complex is the theological heart of the temple, the space where the most sacred rituals were performed, where the mysteries of Osiris's death and resurrection were enacted, where the pharaoh entered the innermost chamber of the divine and communed, in darkness and in secrecy, with the god of the dead. Southern extension of the temple, the wing that gives the building its distinctive L-shaped plan, contains additional chambers and corridors, including the Gallery of the Ancestors, where the Abydos King List is carved. The gallery is a long, narrow corridor, its walls lined with cartouches. The 76 names, arranged in 3 rows, beginning with Menes and ending with Seti. The corridor is not merely a hallway. It is a sacred space, a place where the pharaoh performed rituals of ancestor worship, making offerings to the collected names of his predecessors, honoring the dead kings whose legacy he claimed and whose authority he invoked. Behind the temple, accessible through a long descending passage, lies the Osirion, one of the most enigmatic structures in Egyptian archaeology. The Osirion is a massive underground chamber built from enormous blocks of red granite and sandstone, its central platform surrounded by a moat of groundwater that seeps up through the bedrock. The structure is designed to simulate an island, the primordial mound of creation, rising from the waters of chaos, the first land that emerged at the beginning of the world. The island motif connects the Osirion to the mythology of Osiris, the god whose body was dismembered and scattered, whose burial places dotted the landscape of Egypt, whose resurrection was the template for all human hopes of life after death. The Osirion was discovered in 1902 by Margaret Murray, working under the direction of Flinders Petrie, the pioneer of systematic archaeology in Egypt. Murray initially believed the structure to be of Old Kingdom date. Its massive, undecorated granite blocks bore no resemblance to the decorated limestone of Seti's temple, and its architectural style recalled the megalithic structures of the Giza Plateau rather than the refined constructions of the 19th dynasty. Later scholars attributed the Osirion to Seti I, based on inscriptions found in the connecting passages between the temple and the underground structure. But the debate about the Osirion's date has never been fully resolved, and the structure's stark, austere, Cyclopean style continues to puzzle scholars who find it difficult to reconcile with the delicate elegance of the temple to which it is attached. The Osirion presents one of the most intriguing architectural puzzles in Egyptian archaeology. The structure consists of a central hall, roughly 30 meters long and 20 meters wide, built from massive blocks of red Aswan granite, some weighing more than 100 tons. The hall is surrounded by a channel of water, a moat that fills naturally from the water table, which at Abydos is only a few meters below the modern surface. The central platform of the hall is raised above the water level, creating the impression of an island surrounded by water, emerging from the flood, recalling the primeval mound of Egyptian creation mythology. The 10 massive granite pillars that support the ceiling of the central hall are among the largest monolithic architectural elements in Egypt. Each pillar is a single block of red granite, quarried at Aswan, more than 200 kilometers to the south, and transported downriver to Abydos. The logistics of quarrying, transporting, and erecting these pillars, each one weighing many tons, each one requiring specialized equipment, skilled labor, and months of work, are comparable to the logistics of the Great Pyramid constructions of the Old Kingdom. The Osirion may be smaller than the pyramids, but the engineering challenges it presented were, on a per-block basis, equally formidable. The architectural style of the Osirion is strikingly different from the style of Seti's temple. The temple is built from fine white limestone, carved with delicate raised reliefs, decorated with painted surfaces of extraordinary refinement. The Osirion is built from massive granite blocks, undecorated, with the exception of some inscriptions added by Meremptah, Seti's grandson, austere and monumental in its visual character. The contrast between the two buildings, one refined, one austere, one decorative, one plain, one limestone, one granite, has led some scholars to question whether they were built by the same pharaoh in the same period as part of the same construction program. The mainstream scholarly view is that the Osirion was built by Seti I as a cenotaph, a symbolic tomb, for the god Osiris. The structure's design, the island, the moat, the massive granite construction, was intended to represent the burial place of Osiris in its most primordial and most cosmic form. The island was the primeval mound, the moat was the primordial ocean, the granite was the indestructible material from which the gods fashioned the first land. The Osirion was not merely a tomb, it was a cosmogonic model, a three-dimensional representation of the moment of creation, built in the most durable material available, at the most sacred site in Egypt, behind the most beautiful temple in the country. The connection between Seti's temple and the Osirion is both physical and theological. A long descending passage connects the rear of the temple to the underground structure. The passage, roughly 128 meters long, descends from the level of the temple floor to the level of the Osirion, which is approximately 15 meters below the surface. The descent is a journey from the world of the living, the temple, to the world of the dead, the Osirion, from the light to the darkness, from the surface to the underworld. The passage was used for ritual purposes. The priests who performed the mysteries of Osiris would descend from the temple to the Osirion, perform the burial rituals in the underground chamber, and then return to the surface, reenacting the journey of the dead from the world of the living to the underworld and back. The difference in artistic quality between the sections of the temple completed by Seti I and those completed by his son, Ramesses II, is one of the most discussed topics in Egyptian art history. The contrast is stark. Seti's reliefs are carved in raised relief. The background is cut away, leaving the figures projecting from the surface. The technique requires extraordinary precision. A single misdirected chisel blow can destroy an entire figure. The result, when executed well, is a relief of extraordinary delicacy. The figures appear to emerge from the stone, their surfaces catching the light, their outlines soft and modulated, their details rendered with a sensitivity that approaches the quality of freestanding sculpture. Ramesses's reliefs, by contrast, are carved in sunk relief. The figures are cut into the surface, leaving the background level untouched. The technique is simpler, faster, and more durable. Sunk relief is less vulnerable to damage and less susceptible to usurpation than raised relief. But the aesthetic result is different. The figures appear to be pressed into the stone rather than emerging from it, their outlines sharp and linear, their surfaces flat and unmodulated. The effect is bolder, more graphic, more dramatic, but less refined, less subtle, less emotionally engaging than Seti's raised relief. The transition from Seti's raised relief to Ramesses's sunk relief is visible within the temple, literally on the same walls, in the same rooms. In the first hypostyle hall, which Ramesses completed after Seti's death, the lower portions of the walls bear Seti's raised relief, completed during his lifetime, while the upper portions bear Ramesses's sunk relief, completed after his death. The boundary between the two styles is sharp, a horizontal line running across the wall, above which the figures are pressed into the stone and below which they project from it. The line marks the moment of Seti's death, the point at which the artistic direction of the temple changed hands, from the father who favoured refinement to the son who favoured impact. Scholars have debated the relative merits of the two styles for generations. Seti's admirers argue that his raised relief represents the summit of Egyptian art, the most technically demanding, the most aesthetically refined, the most emotionally profound carving technique available to the Egyptian sculptor. Ramesses's defenders argue that his sunk relief is more appropriate for monumental architecture, more visible from a distance, more durable over time, more effectively communicating the political message that the reliefs were designed to deliver. The debate is, in a sense, a debate about the purpose of art, whether art should aspire to beauty, Seti's position, or to power, Rameses's position. Both positions are valid. Both are visible in the temple. And the temple, containing both, is a dialogue between father and son, between beauty and power, between the artist and the propagandist. The 7 chapels are each roofed with a false vault, a corbelled ceiling constructed from horizontal courses of limestone that step progressively inward until they meet at the top, creating an arch that is pointed rather than rounded. The false vaults are decorated with golden stars on a deep blue background, the standard Egyptian representation of the night sky, and with the cartouches of Seti I repeated in rows along the vault, asserting the pharaoh's presence in the celestial dome above each divine resident. The vaults create an intimate, enclosed atmosphere. Each chapel is small enough to feel personal, tall enough to feel elevated, dark enough to feel sacred. The 7 chapels are, in architectural terms, 7 individual shrines, 7 miniature temples within a larger temple, each one complete in itself, each one dedicated to a specific deity, each one providing a distinct sensory and theological experience. The Osiris Chapel, the central and most important of the 7, leads to the Osiris Complex, a suite of additional chambers that extends behind the line of chapels into the deeper recesses of the temple. The complex includes the Hall of Osiris, flanked by smaller chapels dedicated to the various forms of the god. Osiris Wenifer, Osiris the Beautiful One, Osiris Kentimentu, Osiris, foremost of the Westerners, and Osiris in his form as ruler of the Duat, the underworld. The complex also includes chapels for Isis and Horus, completing the Osirian triad, father, mother and son, the divine family whose mythology was the theological foundation of Egyptian kingship. The reliefs in the Osiris complex are among the most theologically significant in the temple. They depict the mysteries of Osiris, the rituals that reenacted the death, dismemberment, and resurrection of the god. The scenes show Isis mourning over the body of Osiris. They show the god Anubis performing the rites of mummification. They show the reassembled body being revived by the magical power of Isis's words and wings. And they showed the resurrected Osiris seated on his throne in the underworld, receiving the homage of the living, judging the dead, ruling the world beyond the grave with the same authority he had exercised in the world above. These scenes are not merely illustrations of a myth. They are liturgical prescriptions, visual guides for the priests who perform the mysteries in the temple's inner chambers. The scenes show what the priests should do, in what order, with what implements, using what texts. They are the instruction manual for the most sacred rituals in the Egyptian calendar. The rituals that reenacted the death and resurrection of the god, that guaranteed the continuation of life after death, that maintained the cosmic balance between life and death, between order and chaos, between the world of the living and the world of the dead. The depiction of the resurrection of Osiris, the moment when the dead god is restored to life by the magical power of Isis, is one of the most emotionally powerful scenes in Egyptian art. Osiris lies on his bier, his body wrapped in mummy bandages, his face in profile, his arms crossed over his chest. Isis bends over him, her wings spread in a gesture of magical protection, her face expressing a grief that is simultaneously personal and cosmic. The scene is tender, intimate, and profoundly human. A wife mourning her husband, a woman using every power at her disposal to bring the man she loves back from the dead. The scene is also cosmic. The resurrection of Osiris is the resurrection of the cosmic order, the restoration of the balance between life and death, the guarantee that the world will continue to exist. The emotional depth of the resurrection scene, its capacity to move the viewer, to evoke genuine feeling, to connect the mythological narrative to the human experience of grief and loss, is one of the qualities that distinguishes the Abydos reliefs from the reliefs at other Egyptian temples. Most Egyptian temple art is formal, hieratic, and emotionally restrained. The figures are idealized, the compositions are conventional, the expressions are serene. At Abydos, the restraint is loosened. The figures are still idealized, the compositions are still conventional. But the emotional register is broader, encompassing not only the serene authority of the divine, but also the grief of the bereaved, the tenderness of the maternal, the intensity of the mystical encounter between the living and the dead. The southern extension of the temple, the wing that creates the L shape, contains several additional features of interest. The Hall of Barks was the room where the sacred barks, the portable boats used to carry the statues of the gods during festival processions, were stored. The barks themselves are gone, but the room remains, a large, empty chamber whose walls are decorated with reliefs showing the procession of the barks during the festivals. The reliefs provide detailed information about the design and decoration of the barks, information that is available from no other source, and that has been invaluable for scholars studying the liturgical practices of the New Kingdom. The so-called Hall of the Butchers, located in the southernmost portion of the temple, was the room where the sacrificial animals were slaughtered and prepared for offering. The room is unfinished. Its walls are partially carved, partially blank, the decoration interrupted by Seti's death and never completed by Ramesses. The unfinished state of the room provides a rare glimpse into the carving process. The preliminary red-line drawings that the artists used as guides for the carving are still visible on the walls, showing the intended composition before the chisel had begun its work. The red-line drawings are, in effect, the artist's sketches, the preliminary studies that preceded the finished relief, the creative process frozen at an intermediate stage, preserved by the accident of Seti's death. The sketches reveal the planning that went into the temple's decoration. Each scene was designed before it was carved. Each figure was positioned, proportioned, and outlined before the chisel touched the stone. The drawings show care corrections, figures that were repositioned, proportions that were adjusted, compositions that were revised before the final version was approved. The corrections demonstrate that the temple's decoration was not improvised. It was planned, carefully, systematically, by artists who understood the conventions of their tradition and who worked within those conventions to produce compositions of the highest quality. The planning process connects to the broader question of artistic authorship in ancient Egypt. The artists who carved the Abydos reliefs are anonymous. Their names are not recorded in any inscription. Their identities are unknown. Their individual contributions to the temple's decoration cannot be distinguished. And yet their work is profoundly personal, marked by a quality of execution and a depth of feeling that distinguishes it from the work of their contemporaries at other sites. The anonymity of the artists is not a deficiency. It is a feature of a cultural system that valued the work above the worker, the creation above the creator, the temple above the individual who carved it. The Osiris cult at Abydos was not merely one of many Egyptian cults. It was the dominant religious movement of the 2nd millennium BC, the cult that attracted the largest number of devotees, that generated the most intense emotional engagement, and that promised the most compelling reward, eternal life. The cult of Osiris transformed Egyptian religion from a system of royal privilege, in which the afterlife was available only to the pharaoh, and, by extension, to members of the royal court, into a system of universal promise, in which the afterlife was available to anyone who lived a just life, who was properly mummified, who received the appropriate funerary rituals, and who could pass the judgment of Osiris in the Hall of Two Truths. This democratization of the afterlife, the extension of eternal life from the pharaoh to the common person, was one of the most significant religious developments in human history. It transformed the relationship between the individual and the divine, between the living and the dead, between the mortal and the eternal. Before the Osiris cult, the afterlife was a privilege. After the Osiris cult, the afterlife was a right earned through moral behavior, through ritual observance, through the performance of the obligations that the cult prescribed. Abydos was the epicenter of this transformation. The mysteries of Osiris, celebrated annually at Abydos, were the public expression of the Osiris theology, the dramatic reenactment of the god's death and resurrection that made the promise of eternal life tangible, visible, and emotionally real. The pilgrims who participated in the mysteries were not merely spectators. They were participants, men and women who experienced, through their physical involvement in the ritual drama, the death and resurrection of the god. The experience was transformative. The pilgrim who returned from Abydos returned changed. assured of eternal life, confident of resurrection, prepared for the journey to the underworld that every Egyptian hoped to make. The Temple of Seti I at Abydos served as the institutional framework for this transformation. The temple's 7 chapels, its Osiris complex, its king list, its reliefs depicting the mysteries. All of these elements contributed to a comprehensive theological program that placed Seti at the center of the Osiris cult and, through the cult, at the center of the most emotionally powerful religious movement in ancient Egypt. The reliefs in the Osiris complex include scenes that are among the most theologically specific in the entire temple. They depict the stages of Osiris's resurrection in exhaustive detail: the gathering of the dismembered body, the wrapping of the mummy, the performance of the opening of the mouth ceremony that restored the god's ability to eat, drink, breathe, and speak. The scenes are accompanied by hieroglyphic texts that provide the words to be spoken at each stage, the hymns, the prayers, the magical formulae that the priests recited as they performed the rituals. The texts are prescriptive. They describe what should be done, how it should be done, and what should be said while it is being done. They are the liturgical manual for the mysteries of Osiris, the most important ritual program in the Egyptian calendar. The depiction of the divine conception of Horus, shown on the walls of the Isis chapel, is one of the most remarkable scenes in the Osiris complex. The scene shows Isis, in the form of a kite, a bird of prey, hovering over the body of the dead Osiris, receiving his seed, conceiving the divine child Horus. The conception is magical. Osiris is dead, his body is mummified, and the conception occurs not through physical union, but through the magical power of Isis's wings and her spoken spells. The scene depicts the most paradoxical moment in Egyptian mythology, the moment when death generates life, when the dead god fathers a living child, when the power of magic reverses the finality of death and produces, from the corpse of the murdered king, the avenger who will restore the cosmic order. The theological implications of this scene are profound. If Osiris can father a child after death, if the divine creative power persists beyond the grave, then death is not the end. Death is a transition, a passage from one form of existence to another, from the world of the living to the world of the dead, from the mortal body to the immortal spirit. The conception of Horus is the proof, the mythological demonstration that the creative power of the divine survives death, and that life continues beyond the grave. This proof was the foundation of the Osiris cult's appeal, the promise of eternal life, the promise that death was not the end, that the individual would survive the dissolution of the body, that the soul would continue to exist in the company of the gods, was the most powerful promise that any religion could make. And the Osiris cult made this promise more convincingly, more emotionally, more dramatically than any other cult in the ancient world. The mysteries at Abydos were the annual demonstration of the promise, the public, theatrical, emotionally overwhelming proof that death could be defeated, that resurrection was possible, that the God who had died and risen could bring his followers with him into eternal life. Seti's temple was the architectural setting for this demonstration. The building was designed to house the mysteries, to provide the sacred space in which the proof was displayed, to create the atmospheric conditions, the darkness, the silence, the incense, the torchlit processions, under which the emotional impact of the mysteries was maximized. The temple was not merely a building. It was a theatre, a purpose-built performance space designed for the most important drama in the Egyptian religious calendar, decorated with the most beautiful art in Egypt and dedicated to the god, whose death and resurrection was the most powerful story ever told on the banks of the Nile. Seti's military campaigns, depicted on the exterior walls of the temple and in the first hypostyle hall, add another dimension to the building's political program. The reliefs show Seti campaigning in Syria and Palestine, in Libya, and in Nubia, the 3 fronts on which Egyptian military power had to be projected to maintain the empire that the 18th dynasty had built. The battle scenes are vivid, detailed, and characteristically 19th dynasty in their composition. The pharaoh in his chariot, charging into the enemy ranks, his bow drawn, his horses galloping, the enemies falling beneath his wheels. The scenes are conventional. Every Egyptian temple from the New Kingdom onward contains similar battle imagery. but the execution at Abydos is, once again, exceptional. The figures are more dynamic, the compositions are more complex, the sense of movement and violence is more convincingly rendered than at most other temples. The exterior battle reliefs are carved in sunk relief rather than raised relief, a choice that reflects both the practical requirements of exterior decoration. Sunk relief is more durable in exposed settings, and the aesthetic difference between the temple's exterior and interior programs. The exterior program is martial. It depicts the pharaoh as warrior, as defender of Egypt, as the military champion who protects the land from foreign enemies. The interior program is devotional. It depicts the pharaoh as worshipper, as servant of the gods, as the spiritual champion who maintains the cosmic order through ritual and prayer. The two programs are complementary. The exterior defends the physical kingdom, while the interior sustains the cosmic one. Together, they present a complete picture of Seti's kingship, a kingship that is simultaneously military and spiritual, active and contemplative, worldly and divine. The Battle of Kadesh, which Seti fought against the Hittites before the more famous engagement of his son, Ramesses II, is depicted on the temple walls with a level of detail that provides valuable historical information about the military campaigns of the early 19th dynasty. The reliefs show the fortified cities of the Levant, the movements of the Egyptian army, the disposition of the Hittite forces, and the personal involvement of the pharaoh in the fighting. The scenes are not merely decorative, they are documentary, visual records of actual military campaigns, providing information about routes, tactics, and opponents that supplements the written historical sources. The transition between the first and second hypostyle halls, between Ramesses's completion and Seti's original work, is one of the most instructive moments in the history of Egyptian art. The visitor walking from the first hall to the second crosses a boundary, not merely an architectural boundary between two rooms, but an artistic boundary between two generations, two sensibilities, two approaches to the relationship between art and power. Ramesses's hall is bold, Seti's hall is refined. Ramesses's reliefs are dramatic, Seti's reliefs are intimate. The two halls, side by side in the same building, represent the two poles of Egyptian art: the monumental and the personal, the public and the private, the art of empire and the art of devotion. The second hypostyle hall's 36 columns, arranged in 3 rows of 12, create a denser, more enclosed, more atmospheric space than the first hall's 24 columns. The columns in the second hall are topped with lotus bud capitals, a traditional New Kingdom design, elegant and restrained, appropriate to the hall's function as the antechamber to the 7 chapels. The walls between the columns are covered with offering scenes, the pharaoh presenting food, drink, incense, and flowers to the gods, performing the rituals that sustained the divine presence in the temple. The scenes are repetitive, the same basic composition repeated with variations for each deity. But the repetition is the point. The repetition demonstrates the comprehensiveness of the pharaoh's devotion, his willingness to serve every god, to perform every ritual, to maintain every divine relationship that the cosmos required. The transition from the second hypostyle hall to the 7 chapels is the temple's most dramatic architectural moment. The rear wall of the hall is pierced by 7 doorways, each one leading to a separate chapel, each one framing a different view of a different divine world. The doorways are arranged in a row, their lintels at the same height, their openings the same width, their proportions identical. The effect is of a series of windows, 7 windows into 7 different divine realms, each one visible from the hall, each one inviting the viewer to look through and to see the god who waits beyond. The 7 doorways were originally all open, providing an unobstructed view from the hypostyle hall through each chapel to the false door at its rear wall. But Ramesses II, when he completed the first hypostyle hall, blocked 6 of the 7 doorways, leaving only the central one, the doorway to the Amun-Ra chapel, open. The blocking was practical. Ramesses needed solid wall space for his relief program in the first hall, but it also changed the temple's architectural experience, reducing the 7-window vista to a single window one, narrowing the view, concentrating the visitor's attention on the central axis, and diminishing the dramatic effect of the original seven-doorway design. The false doors at the rear of each chapel are the termini of the temple's seven parallel axes, the points where the sacred journey from the entrance to the innermost space reaches its conclusion. The false door is a distinctive Egyptian architectural element, a carved stone panel that resembles a door but that does not open. The false door was the interface between the world of the living and the world of the dead, the point where the deceased king, residing in the afterlife, could pass through the barrier of stone and receive the offerings that were placed before the door by the living priests. The false doors in Seti's chapels are carved with the same refinement that characterizes the rest of the temple's decoration. Their panels recessed, their frames molded, their inscriptions carved with the precision of a jeweler's tool. The quality of the false doors is itself evidence of Seti's artistic program. In most Egyptian temples, the false doors are functional rather than decorative, simple carved panels, adequate to their liturgical purpose, but not artistically distinguished. At Abydos, the false doors are works of art, each one carved with the same care, the same refinement, the same attention to detail that characterizes the finest reliefs on the temple's walls. The quality extends to every element of the building, from the most visible reliefs to the least visible architectural details. Nothing is neglected, nothing is merely functional. Everything is beautiful, and the comprehensiveness of the beauty, its extension to every surface, every element, every corner of the building, is the strongest evidence of the artistic ambition that drove the temple's construction. The deeper truth of the Temple of Seti I at Abydos is the truth about the relationship between beauty and power, between the aesthetic quality of a work of art and the political purpose it was designed to serve. The reliefs at Abydos are beautiful. They are, by the consensus of scholars, the finest raised reliefs in Egyptian art, the pinnacle of a tradition that had been developing for more than 1,500 years. The figures are modelled with a sensitivity that approaches portraiture. The compositions are balanced, harmonious, and filled with a sense of calm authority that is simultaneously human and divine. The carving is technically flawless. The lines are clean, the surfaces are smooth, the transitions between planes are subtle and controlled. The paint, traces of which survive in protected areas, was applied with the same refinement that characterizes the carving, using a palette of reds, blues, greens, and yellows that complemented the warm white of the limestone. But the reliefs are not merely beautiful, they are political. Every scene, every figure, every hieroglyph serves a political purpose, the establishment and reinforcement of Seti's legitimacy as pharaoh. The scenes show Seti in the presence of the gods, receiving their blessings, performing their rituals, sharing their divinity. The message is clear. The gods accept Seti. The gods endorse Seti. Seti is not an usurper, not a parvenu, not a general's son who lucked into the throne. He is the legitimate king, accepted by the gods, connected to the ancestors, standing in the unbroken line of divine rulers that stretches back to Menes. The beauty is the vehicle for this message. A crude, badly carved relief would deliver the same political content, the same scenes, the same gods, the same message of legitimacy. But a crude relief would not convince. A crude relief would betray the effort, would reveal the calculation, would expose the propaganda for what it was. The beauty conceals the propaganda. The beauty makes the message feel natural, inevitable, divinely ordained. The beauty says, this is not a political claim, this is not a human construction. This is the natural order, the gods embracing their chosen ruler, the cosmos confirming its proper arrangement, the universe operating as it should. The beauty makes the propaganda invisible, and invisible propaganda is the most effective propaganda of all. This is not science fiction. This is the sociology of art, the study of how aesthetic quality serves political purposes, how beauty functions as a medium for power, how the most refined artistic productions are often the most calculated political interventions. The reliefs at Abydos are not beautiful despite being political. They are beautiful because they are political. The political purpose demanded the beauty. The legitimacy claim required the finest craftsmanship, and the craftsmen, the anonymous artists who carved the reliefs, who devoted their skills to the service of a pharaoh, who needed their art more than he needed their labor, produced a body of work that has outlasted the political purpose it was designed to serve. The question of why Seti's reliefs are so much finer than those of any other pharaoh is one that Egyptologists have debated without reaching a definitive answer. Several factors may contribute. First, the limestone at Abydos is of exceptional quality, fine-grained, even-textured, and responsive to the chisel in ways that coarser stones are not. The material allowed the sculptors to achieve a level of detail that would have been impossible in the sandstone used at Edfu or Dendera, or the granite used in the Osirion. The stone itself was a factor in the quality of the art. Second, the sculptors who worked at Abydos may have been the finest artisans available to the 19th dynasty. The evidence suggests that Seti invested extraordinary resources in the decoration of his temple, recruiting the most skilled craftsmen from across Egypt, providing them with the finest materials, and allowing them the time and the conditions necessary to produce work of the highest quality. The reliefs at Abydos were not rushed. They were not produced on a deadline. They were produced with the patience and the perfectionism that characterize the finest art in any tradition. Third, the raised relief technique that Seti favored is inherently more difficult and inherently more rewarding than the sunk relief technique that Ramesses preferred. Raised relief requires the sculptor to cut away the entire background surface, leaving the figures projecting from the wall. The process is slow, laborious, and unforgiving. A mistake in the background cannot be corrected without damaging the figure, but the result, when executed by a master, is a relief of extraordinary three-dimensionality. Figures that seem to float on the surface of the stone, that catch and release the light with every change of angle, that possess a physical presence that sunk relief cannot match. The combination of these factors, exceptional stone, exceptional craftsman, and an exceptionally demanding technique, produced a body of work that is, by any standard of artistic judgment, the finest raised relief in Egyptian history. The reliefs at Abydos are to Egyptian art what the sculptures of the Parthenon are to Greek art. The acknowledged masterpiece, the universally recognized pinnacle, the work against which all other works in the tradition are measured. But the comparison with the Parthenon raises an important question. The Parthenon sculptures were created in a democratic society, by artists who were celebrated as individuals and who worked within a culture that valued personal expression and artistic innovation. The Abydos reliefs were created in an autocratic society by artists who are entirely anonymous and who worked within a culture that valued tradition and conformity above all other artistic values. The Parthenon sculptors were free. The Abydos sculptors were servants, servants of a pharaoh, servants of a temple, servants of a tradition that had been developing for 15 centuries, and that left very little room for individual expression. And yet the reliefs are personal. They are not merely competent. They are inspired, produced by artists who were deeply engaged with their material, who understood the possibilities of their medium, who pushed the boundaries of their tradition without breaking them. The relief of Seti pouring a libation before Osiris, the scene in the second hypostyle hall, that many scholars consider the single finest relief in all of Egypt, is the work of a master who has transcended the conventions of his art without abandoning them. The composition is traditional, the poses are traditional, the proportions are traditional, but the execution, the modeling of the surfaces, the rendering of the garments, the expression on the faces, goes beyond tradition into something that can only be called personal vision. The artist is anonymous, but the art is not. This is the paradox of Egyptian art at its best. The paradox that the most impersonal of artistic traditions, the tradition that most ruthlessly suppressed individual expression, could produce work of such profoundly personal quality. The answer may be that the suppression of individual expression forced the artist's creativity into other channels, into the refinement of technique, into the subtlety of surface treatment, into the minute variations of proportion and composition that distinguish a masterpiece from a competent work within a fixed stylistic framework. The Egyptian artist could not innovate in form, but they could innovate in quality, and the quality of the Abydos reliefs, the sheer technical mastery, the depth of feeling, the spiritual intensity, is the product of an artistic tradition that channeled its creative energy into perfection rather than innovation. The reliefs at Abydos were created to serve a political purpose, but they have outlasted their purpose. The political context, the legitimacy crisis, the dynastic competition, the need to establish the 19th dynasty's credentials, is history. The art endures, and the endurance of the art, its capacity to move viewers 3,200 years after its creation, across every cultural boundary, in every language, for every audience, is the strongest evidence that the art transcends the politics it was designed to serve. The propaganda is dead, the beauty is alive, and the temple, the house of the beauty, the container of the art, the building that holds in its limestone walls the finest relief carving in the history of ancient Egypt, is alive with it. The 7 chapels, each with its vaulted ceiling, its stellar decoration, its specific theological program, create an experience that is simultaneously unified and differentiated. Each chapel is a separate world, a self-contained sacred space, dedicated to a specific deity, decorated with scenes that are specific to that deity's cult. The Osiris Chapel is somber, focused on death and resurrection. The Amun-Ra Chapel is regal, focused on cosmic kingship. The Horus Chapel is martial, focused on the defeat of chaos and the protection of the pharaoh. The Isis Chapel is maternal, focused on the magical power of the goddess and her role as the protector of her son. Each chapel has its own mood, its own atmosphere, its own theological character, and the visitor who walks from chapel to chapel, from Seti's chapel to Ptah's, from Ra-Horakt's to Amun-Ra's, from Osiris's to Isis's to Horus's, experiences a theological progression that is also an aesthetic progression, a journey through the full range of Egyptian religious emotion, from the solemnity of death worship to the ecstasy of cosmic celebration. The painted decoration of the chapels, partially preserved, partially faded, partially restored, adds another dimension to the experience. The colours are muted now, faded by 3,000 years of exposure, dimmed by the deterioration of the pigments, altered by the chemical reactions that occur when mineral-based paints are exposed to moisture and light. But traces survive: the deep blue of the celestial ceiling, the warm red of the skin tones, the green of the vegetation, the gold of the divine crowns, and the sacred objects. The traces are sufficient to suggest what the chapels would have looked like when new. 7 enclosed spaces, each one a blaze of colour, each one a painted world in which the gods were present, not merely in carved form, but in full polychromatic splendour. The preservation of the interior reliefs at Abydos, their survival in relatively good condition, despite the deterioration of the exterior, is primarily the result of the temple's geographic position. Abydos is located in the low desert, away from the Nile, in a region that receives almost no rainfall. The dryness of the environment has been the temple's greatest protector, preventing the moisture-related damage that has destroyed painted surfaces at wetter sites. The temple was also partially buried by sand for centuries, which sealed the interior from wind and temperature fluctuation. And the white limestone from which the temple is built is a more stable material than the sandstone used at many other Upper Egyptian temples, less porous, less vulnerable to salt weathering, more resistant to the chemical degradation that destroys carved surfaces over time. The ongoing archaeological work at Abydos continues to produce discoveries that deepen our understanding of both the early pharaonic period and the later temple traditions. The University of Pennsylvania's excavations at el-Kab, which have been ongoing since the 1960s under a succession of directors, have revealed new information about the First Dynasty tombs, including evidence of the scale and the organization of the retainer sacrifices, the types of grave goods deposited with the earliest kings, and the architectural evolution of the royal tomb from a simple pit to a complex multi-chambered structure. The German Archaeological Institute's excavations at the town site of Abydos have revealed the remains of the settlement that supported the temple. The houses, workshops, and administrative buildings of the community that served the Osiris cult. The excavations have shown that Abydos was not merely a cemetery and a temple site. It was a functioning town, a community of priests, craftsmen, and labourers who lived in the shadow of the temple, who depended on the temple for their livelihood, and who maintained the rituals and the traditions of the Osiris cult across generations. The discovery of the royal boat burials at Abydos, a series of mud-brick-lined pits containing the remains of wooden boats dating to the First Dynasty, has added another dimension to our understanding of the site's early history. The boats, each roughly 25 meters long, were buried in the desert near the tombs of the earliest kings. Their purpose is debated. They may have been funerary boats designed to transport the deceased king to the afterlife, or they may have been ceremonial vessels used in the rituals that accompanied the royal burial. Whatever their function, their presence at Abydos confirms that the site was, from the very beginning of the pharaonic period, a center of royal ritual and royal burial, a place where the kings of unified Egypt chose to be buried, where their boats were interred, where their names were inscribed, and where their memory was preserved. The preservation of the Temple of Seti I is an ongoing concern. The white limestone from which the temple is built is a relatively stable material, harder and less porous than the sandstone used at many other Upper Egyptian temples, but it is not immune to deterioration. The carved surfaces are slowly eroding, losing detail, losing sharpness, losing the precision that makes the reliefs the finest in Egypt. The painted decoration is fading, the pigments losing their vibrancy, the colors merging into the neutral tone of the limestone, and the structural integrity of the building is being gradually compromised by the infiltration of moisture from the surrounding soil, by the weight of the accumulated debris on the roof, by the seismic activity that affects the entire Upper Egyptian region. The conservation program at Abydos, conducted by ARS and the Egyptian Ministry of Tourism and Antiquities, addresses these threats through a combination of structural stabilization, surface conservation, and environmental management. The program is underfunded. The costs of comprehensive conservation exceed the available resources, and priorities must be set among competing demands. The reliefs in the 7 chapels receive the most attention. They are the most artistically significant, the most vulnerable, and the most visited. The reliefs in the less accessible areas of the temple, the southern extension, the Osiris complex, the Hall of the Butchers, receive less attention, not because they are less important, but because the resources available for their conservation are limited. The challenge of conserving the Abydos reliefs is complicated by the political history of the region. Abydos is located in Sohag Governorate, a region of Upper Egypt that has experienced periods of social and political instability. The temple has been, at times, difficult to access for tourists and for conservation teams. The instability has affected the temple's visitor numbers, which in turn has affected the revenue available for conservation. The relationship between political stability, tourism revenue, and conservation funding is a vicious circle. Instability reduces tourism, which reduces revenue, which reduces conservation, which reduces the condition of the monument, which reduces the motivation for tourists to make the journey. Breaking the circle requires investment in security, in infrastructure, in conservation, and in the promotion of the site as a destination for the growing number of cultural tourists who are willing to venture beyond the standard Luxor itinerary. The archaeological potential of Abydos is far from exhausted. The site extends over a vast area, several square kilometers of desert, containing the tombs, temples, settlements, and cemeteries of more than 3,000 years of continuous occupation. Only a fraction of this area has been excavated. The remainder, the unexcavated portions of the cemetery, the unexplored sections of the town, the areas beneath the modern agricultural land, contains archaeological deposits that have been accumulating since the predynastic period. Each new excavation season reveals new information. Each new discovery adds to the picture. And the picture of Abydos as the spiritual heart of ancient Egypt, the oldest sacred site in the Nile Valley, the city of the dead and the living, the threshold of the underworld, grows more detailed, more complex, and more compelling with each passing year. The relationship between Abydos and the Egyptian afterlife is not merely historical, it is emotional. For the ancient Egyptians, Abydos was not just a sacred site. It was the most emotionally charged location in their religious landscape, the place where the most beloved god was buried, where the most powerful rituals were performed, where the most personal prayers were offered. The stelae left by pilgrims, hundreds of them inscribed with names, titles, prayers, and personal messages, are among the most emotionally affecting objects in Egyptian archaeology. They are the voices of individuals, men and women who travelled to Abydos, who stood before the tomb of Osiris, who prayed for eternal life, and who left behind a stone tablet inscribed with their name and their hope, their fear and their faith, their mortality and their yearning for immortality. The stelae are still there, scattered across the desert, stored in museums, published in scholarly volumes. The names are still legible, the prayers are still readable, and the hope, the desperate, universal, profoundly human hope that death is not the end, that the loved one will be seen again, that the journey continues beyond the grave, is still palpable, still moving, still recognizable to any human being who has ever lost someone they loved and who has ever wondered, in the silence that follows the loss, whether the silence is truly final. The silence at Abydos is not final. The stelae speak, the reliefs speak, the King List speaks, the Osirian speaks. And the temple, the most beautiful temple in Egypt, standing in the most sacred city in the Nile Valley, holding in its limestone walls the finest art and the most curated history and the most profound theological program ever produced by the pharaonic civilization, speaks with a clarity and a beauty that 3,200 years have not diminished. The Osiris Mysteries at Abydos, the annual festival that drew pilgrims from across Egypt, and that was the most emotionally powerful religious event in the Egyptian calendar, were performed in a procession that passed directly in front of, and likely through, the Temple of Seti. The temple's position on the pilgrim's route was not accidental. It was strategic, designed to ensure that every pilgrim who came to Abydos for the mysteries would encounter the temple, would see its reliefs, would absorb its political message, and would carry that message back to their home community. The temple was not merely a destination. It was a billboard, positioned on the busiest pilgrimage route in Egypt, decorated with the finest art in the country, broadcasting the message of 19th dynasty legitimacy to an audience of thousands. The mysteries themselves, as described in ancient texts, followed a sequence that began with the emergence of the statue of Wepawet from the temple, the jackal god, the pathfinder, the deity who opened the way for the dead to travel to the underworld. The emergence of Wepawet was the signal for the procession to begin. The crowd that had gathered, pilgrims, priests, soldiers, musicians, dancers, fell into formation behind the jackal standard and began the long walk from the temple to the tomb of Osiris at el-Kab. The procession was not merely a walk, it was a drama, a theatrical performance in which the participants enacted the roles of the gods and the goddesses who were involved in the Osiris narrative. The battle between the forces of Horus and the forces of Seth was staged along the route, a choreographed combat that produced real excitement, real danger, and real injuries. The mourning of Isis was enacted by women who walked behind the bark, wailing, tearing their garments, expressing a grief that was simultaneously theatrical and genuine. The resurrection of Osiris was enacted at the tomb itself. The bark was placed in the tomb, the mourning reached its climax, and then, at the appointed moment, the bark was brought forth, resurrected, restored, triumphant. The emotional impact of the mysteries was enormous. Ancient accounts described the participants weeping during the mourning procession, fighting during the battle, and erupting in joy during the resurrection. The festival was a catharsis, a collective emotional experience that purged the community of its grief and its fear, and that renewed its confidence in the promise of eternal life. The mysteries were the ancient Egyptian equivalent of the Passion Play, a dramatic reenactment of the central narrative of the faith, performed annually, witnessed by thousands, and believed to be spiritually efficacious for all who participated. Seti's temple, positioned at the starting point of this annual drama, was the architectural frame within which the drama began. The procession started at the temple. The reliefs on the temple's walls depicted the scenes that the procession would enact. The chapels housed the gods whose roles would be performed, and the King List, the curated genealogy, the selective history, the political narrative carved in stone, was the backdrop against which the cosmic drama of death and resurrection played out. The integration of political propaganda into a religious spectacle is one of the most sophisticated features of Seti's program at Abydos. The pilgrims came for the mysteries. They came for Osiris. They came for the promise of eternal life. And while they were there, while they were emotionally engaged, spiritually receptive, open to suggestion in ways that they would not have been in their ordinary lives, they encountered Seti's political message. The message was subtle. It was embedded in the architecture, encoded in the reliefs, inscribed in the King List. It did not interrupt the mysteries. It accompanied them, a quiet, persistent, aesthetically beautiful presence that worked on the pilgrim's consciousness without the pilgrim being aware of it. This is the genius of the Temple of Abydos. The temple does not merely house political propaganda. It integrates political propaganda into a religious experience, fusing the political and the sacred so seamlessly that the distinction between them dissolves. The pilgrim who worships at the temple is simultaneously worshipping the gods and endorsing the dynasty. The pilgrim who admires the reliefs is simultaneously appreciating the art and accepting the political narrative. The pilgrim who reads the King List is simultaneously learning history and absorbing propaganda. The two functions, the religious and the political, are inseparable. They are aspects of the same experience. And the experience, the total, immersive, aesthetically overwhelming experience of the Temple of Abydos, is designed to produce both effects simultaneously, without the participant being aware that they are being politically manipulated while they are being spiritually transformed. The effectiveness of this strategy is demonstrated by the temple's enduring reputation. 3,200 years after its construction, the Temple of Seti I at Abydos is still admired, not for its political program, which is understood and discounted by modern visitors, but for its artistic quality, which transcends the political purpose it was designed to serve. The propaganda has been neutralized by history. The beauty has not. And the beauty that was designed to make the propaganda invisible, to give the political message the appearance of divine truth, has become the temple's true legacy. The propaganda is remembered because it is interesting. The beauty is remembered because it is beautiful. And the beauty, in the end, is what endures. The math is striking. Seti ruled for 15 years. His temple has been admired for 3,200. The political purpose that drove the construction was relevant for a single generation. The artistic quality that resulted from the construction has been relevant for every generation since. The ratio is roughly 1 to 200, one generation of political utility for every 200 generations of aesthetic admiration. The propaganda was a means, the beauty was an end, and the end, the enduring, timeless, generation-spanning beauty of the finest reliefs in Egyptian history, has justified the means more completely than Seti could ever have imagined. Stand in the second hypostyle hall. Look at the reliefs. The light enters from the western doorway, catching the raised surfaces, casting thin shadows that give the figures depth and dimension. Seti stands before Osiris, pouring a libation from a golden vessels, his body inclined slightly forward, his expression composed, his garments flowing with a naturalism that makes the limestone seem soft. Osiris sits enthroned, his body wrapped in mummy bandages, his hands holding the crook and flail, his face expressing the serene, impassive authority of a god who has conquered death and who rules the world beyond the grave. Between them, the stream of water falls from the vessel, a carved line, thin as a thread, connecting the living king to the dead god, the worshipper to the worshipped, the political to the theological. The scene is simple. It is one of hundreds in the temple, one of hundreds of scenes showing Seti in communion with the gods. But it is also, in its simplicity, perfect. The proportions are right. The composition is balanced. The carving is flawless. The relationship between the figures, the living king and the dead god, the pourer and the recipient, the mortal and the immortal, is expressed with a clarity and a grace that makes the viewer forget for a moment that this is a political document carved in stone 3,200 years ago. The scene transcends its purpose. The art transcends the propaganda. And the viewer, standing in the dim hall, looking at the relief in the fading light, is no longer a tourist in a ruined temple. The viewer is a a witness to an act of worship that was performed 3,200 years ago, and that is preserved in carved limestone with a beauty that makes it seem as if it happened this morning. Abydos teaches us that art is always political, and that the politics of art do not diminish its beauty. The reliefs are propaganda, they are also masterpieces. The two descriptions are not contradictory, they are complementary, two aspects of a single reality, inseparable from each other, each one informing and enriching the other. The propaganda gives the art its urgency, the art gives the propaganda its power, and the combination, the synthesis of political purpose and aesthetic achievement, produces a body of work that is simultaneously one of the most calculated political interventions and one of the most beautiful artistic achievements in the history of ancient Egypt. The modern visitor's experience of the Temple of Seti I at Abydos is shaped by the temple's relative obscurity. Unlike Karnak, Luxor, or the Valley of the Kings, which are located in or near the city of Luxor and are visited by millions of tourists each year, Abydos is remote, roughly 3 hours' drive from Luxor, 160 kilometers to the north, in a part of Upper Egypt that is off the standard tourist itinerary. The journey is long, the road is monotonous, and the destination, when reached, does not offer the dramatic visual spectacle of a pylon-fronted temple or a cliff-cut tomb. The exterior of the temple is ruined, the setting is unremarkable, low desert, agricultural land, a dusty modern town, but the interior rewards the journey. The transition from the ruined exterior to the exquisite interior is one of the most dramatic in Egyptian archaeology. The visitor passes from a world of damaged sandstone and collapsed walls into a world of polished white limestone, delicate raised relief, and the dim, cool, sacred atmosphere that the temple's builders designed. The contrast is intentional. The temple was not designed to be approached from the outside. It was designed to be experienced from the inside. The exterior was a shell, a functional structure that protected the sacred interior from the elements. The interior was the purpose, the sacred space where the rituals were performed, where the reliefs told their stories, where the gods resided in their chapels, and where the beauty of the art transformed the political purpose into something that transcended politics. The temple's remoteness has paradoxically contributed to its preservation. Unlike the heavily visited temples of Luxor, Abydos has been spared the worst effects of mass tourism. The foot traffic, the humidity, the physical contact that gradually erode carved surfaces and degrade painted decoration. The temple receives far fewer visitors than Karnak or the Valley of the Kings, and the visitors who do come are typically more knowledgeable, more attentive, and more respectful of the monument's fragility. The result is a temple that is, despite its age, in remarkably good condition. Its reliefs sharp, its surfaces clean, its chapels intact, its archaeological record largely undisturbed. The American Research Center in Egypt, ARCE, has been conducting conservation work at the Temple of Seti I for several decades, focusing on the stabilization of structural elements, the cleaning of decorated surfaces, and the documentation of the temple's relief program. The work has included the careful removal of soot and surface deposits from the painted ceilings of the 7 chapels, revealing traces of the original color scheme. Deep blue celestial vaults, golden stars, polychromatic figures of gods and kings. The restoration has not been as dramatic as the ceiling restoration at Dendera. The colors at Abydos are more faded, the preservation less complete. But the traces that remain are sufficient to demonstrate the original quality of the decoration and to confirm the reputation of the temple as the finest artistic achievement of the 19th dynasty. The relief of Seti I embracing the god Osiris, located in the Osiris Chapel, is frequently cited as the single finest individual relief in Egyptian art. The scene shows Seti standing before the enthroned Osiris, his body inclined slightly forward, his arms extended in a gesture of supplication and devotion. Osiris is seated on his throne, his body wrapped in bandages, his skin painted green, the color of regeneration and the afterlife, his hands holding the crook and flail. Between them, a ritual connection is established, the living king communing with the dead god, the pharaoh seeking the blessing of the ruler of the underworld, the mortal reaching toward the immortal across the boundary of death. The carving of this scene is exceptional. The modelling of Seti's arms, the musculature visible beneath the skin, the tendons taut, the fingers articulated, is the finest anatomical rendering in Egyptian relief art. The draping of the garment, the linen kilt, falling in parallel folds from the waist, catching the light in a way that suggests transparency, is carved with a naturalism that is unprecedented in the pharaonic tradition. The expression on Seti's face, composed, reverent, inwardly focused, conveys a spiritual intensity that makes the viewer feel, however briefly, that the scene is not a representation but a reality. The carving does not depict a ritual, it performs one. The stone is not a medium. It is a window into a moment of divine encounter that occurred 3,200 years ago, and that is preserved in carved limestone with a vividness that makes it seem present. The temple's role in the broader context of Egyptian temple architecture is significant. Seti's temple at Abydos belongs to the tradition of the New Kingdom mortuary temple, the type of building that pharaohs of the 18th and 19th dynasties constructed on the west bank of the Nile at Thebes. The standard mortuary temple served as the cult center for the deceased pharaoh, the place where offerings were made and rituals were performed to sustain the king's ka in the afterlife. Seti's temple fulfills this function, but it also transcends it. By building at Abydos rather than at Thebes, by dedicating the temple to 7 gods rather than to one, by incorporating the King List and the Osiris complex into the architectural program, Seti created a building that was more than a mortuary temple. It was a statement, a comprehensive, architecturally sophisticated, artistically unparalleled statement of dynastic legitimacy, theological ambition, and spiritual devotion. The statement succeeded. The 19th dynasty, founded by a military officer with no royal blood, went on to produce the 2 most famous pharaohs in Egyptian history, Seti I and Ramesses II. The dynasty ruled for nearly a century. It expanded the empire, built the most colossal monuments, and established a legacy that dominated Egyptian memory for generations. And the foundation of that legacy, the building that established the dynasty's credentials, that connected it to the deepest roots of the pharaonic tradition, that demonstrated, through the sheer beauty of its art, the legitimacy of its claim to the throne, was the Temple of Seti I at Abydos. The beauty was the argument, the art was the proof, and the proof, carved in white limestone, in the finest raised relief in the history of Egypt, on the walls of the most sacred temple in the most sacred city in the Nile Valley, is still there, still legible, still beautiful, still making its argument 3,200 years after the argument was first made. The argument is, this dynasty belongs, this king is legitimate, these gods endorse him, and the evidence of the beauty, the evidence of the craftsmanship, the evidence of the devotion that produced the finest art in the history of Egyptian civilization speaks for itself. The evidence is carved in stone, the evidence is raised in relief, the evidence is painted in colors that have survived 3 millennia, and the evidence, to anyone who sees it, to anyone who makes the 3-hour drive from Luxor, who crosses the threshold from the ruined exterior to the exquisite interior, who stands in the dim light of the second hypostyle hall and looks at the reliefs of Seti in communion with the gods, is overwhelming. The beauty endures, the argument endures, and the temple, the most beautiful temple in Egypt, the spiritual heart of the most ancient sacred city in the Nile Valley, endures with them, in limestone, in relief, in the silence of the desert, in the dim light of the chapels, in the presence of the gods, who may be gone but whose images remain, carved by anonymous masters 3,200 years ago in stone that still catches the light and still speaks to anyone who enters. The comparison between Seti's artistic program and Ramesses's artistic program illuminates a fundamental tension in the relationship between art and power, a tension that every ruler who has ever used art for political purposes has had to navigate. Seti chose refinement, Ramesses chose scale. Seti built the most beautiful temple, Ramesses built the most colossal. Seti carved raised relief, delicate, labor-intensive, aesthetically demanding. Ramesses carved sunk relief, bold, efficient, visually imposing. The father whispered, the son shouted. And both strategies worked. Seti established the dynasty's credentials, and Ramesses consolidated its power. The Temple of Abydos is the whisper. Abu symbol is the shout. Together, they constitute the most comprehensive artistic program of any Egyptian dynasty. A program that encompassed both the intimate and the monumental, both the refined and the colossal, both the art of devotion and the art of domination. The fact that both approaches, the whisper and the shout, the refined and the colossal, were produced by the same dynasty, in the same generation, by a father and a son who shared the throne as co-regents for several years, tells us something important about the flexibility of the 19th dynasty's artistic program. The dynasty did not have a single aesthetic. It had two, one for each pharaoh, one for each personality, one for each political moment. Seti's aesthetic was appropriate for the moment of dynastic foundation, the moment when legitimacy had to be established, when credentials had to be demonstrated, when the beauty of the art had to compensate for the thinness of the bloodline. Rameses's aesthetic was appropriate for the moment of dynastic consolidation, the moment when power had to be displayed, when enemies had to be intimidated, when the scale of the monuments had to match the scale of the empire. The two aesthetics are complementary. They are not in competition. Seti's beauty does not diminish Rameses's power. Rameses's power does not diminish Seti's beauty. Together, they constitute a complete artistic statement, a statement that encompasses both the personal and the political, both the spiritual and the military, both the intimate devotion of the father and the imperial ambition of the son. The Temple of Abydos is the foundation, Abu symbol is the culmination, and the 19th dynasty, standing on both, is the most artistically productive dynasty in the history of ancient Egypt. The relief technique of raised relief, the technique that Seti favored, and that makes the Abydos reliefs the finest in Egypt, is worth examining in more detail. Raised relief is produced by carving away the background, cutting the limestone surface down to a uniform depth, leaving the figures projecting above the background level. The technique requires the sculptor to work on two planes simultaneously, the plane of the figures and the plane of the background, and to maintain the distinction between the two planes across the entire surface of the wall. The background must be perfectly flat. The figures must be uniformly raised. The transition between the two must be clean, sharp, and consistent. The difficulty of this technique is considerable. A single error in the background, a chisel blow that goes too deep, a surface that is not perfectly level, is visible and irrecoverable. The sculptor cannot add material to a surface that has been cut too deeply. The error becomes permanent, and the permanence of the error means that the sculptor must work with extreme care, planning each chisel blow, controlling each stroke, maintaining a level of concentration that is physically and mentally exhausting. The raised relief technique also produces the most beautiful results. Because the figures project from the background, they catch and release the light in ways that sunk relief cannot. As the sun moves across the sky, or as a torch is carried through the temple, the angle of the light changes and the figures appear to move. Shadows form and dissolve, surfaces brighten and darken. The figures seem to breathe, to shift, to turn, to respond to the changing light with a vitality that makes them seem alive. This vitality, this sense of animation produced by the interaction of light and carved surface, is the distinctive quality of the Abydos reliefs. The figures are not static. They are dynamic, alive to the light, responsive to the viewer's position, changing in appearance with every step the viewer takes, every shift of the torch, every minute of the passing day. The reliefs are not merely images. They are performances, three-dimensional compositions that interact with the light to produce a continuously changing display of form, shadow, and surface. The performance is silent, but it is eloquent, and the eloquence, the capacity of the carved stone to speak through light and shadow, to communicate emotion through the modulation of surface and depth, is the ultimate achievement of the Egyptian raised relief tradition. The tradition reached its peak at Abydos. The reliefs in the 7 chapels, in the Osiris complex, in the second hypostyle hall, these are the finest examples of the raised relief technique in the entire corpus of Egyptian art. They represent the work of a generation of sculptors who had mastered every aspect of their craft, who understood the properties of the limestone, who controlled the chisel with absolute precision, who perceived the relationship between surface and light with the insight of trained artists and the skill of practiced craftsmen. These sculptors are anonymous. Their names are not recorded. Their individual contributions to the temple's decoration cannot be distinguished. They worked within a tradition that valued the work above the worker, that credited the pharaoh with the artistic achievement of his craftsmen, and that denied the individual sculptor the recognition that his skill deserved. The anonymity is the tradition, the art is the legacy, and the art, the finest raised relief in the history of Egyptian civilization, is preserved on the walls of the Temple of Seti I at Abydos, waiting for anyone who makes the journey, who crosses the threshold, who enters the dim hall and looks at the reliefs in the changing light, to see what anonymous masters could achieve when they were given the finest stone, the finest tools, the finest patron, and the freedom to create the most beautiful art in the world. The sacred geography of Abydos, the arrangement of temples, tombs, processional routes, and pilgrimage paths across the landscape, is itself a document of religious history that spans more than 3,000 years. The site extends from the floodplain of the Nile, where the Temple of Seti and the earlier temples stood, to the low desert, where the el-Kab cemetery and the Osirion are located, to the high desert cliffs that form the western boundary of the landscape. The topography creates a natural processional route from the cultivated land, the world of the living, through the low desert, the boundary zone, to the cemetery, the world of the dead. The route was walked by pilgrims for millennia, a physical journey that replicated the spiritual journey from life to death to resurrection. The Temple of Ramesses II at Abydos, located roughly 300 meters to the northwest of Seti's temple, was built by Ramesses to complement his father's creation. Ramesses' temple is smaller, less refined, and more conventional in its plan, a single sanctuary temple, without the seven-chapel arrangement that makes Seti's temple unique. But it is also a building of considerable interest. Its reliefs, while not as fine as Seti's, include scenes of Ramesses and Seti together, performing rituals, roping a bull, making offerings to the gods. The scenes are unusual in Egyptian temple art because they depict two pharaohs working together, the living king, Ramesses, and the deceased king, Seti, sharing the sacred space of the temple, collaborating in the maintenance of the cosmic order. The depiction of Ramesses and Seti together in the Ramesses temple confirms the importance that the son attached to his father's legacy. Ramesses, who would become the most prolific builder in Egyptian history, never forgot that his legitimacy rested on the foundation that his father had laid. At Abydos, at Karnak, in the military campaigns of Syria and Palestine, the temple that Ramesses built at Abydos was an act of filial piety, a tribute to the father whose artistic and political program had established the dynasty's credentials, whose temple at Abydos was the most beautiful building in Egypt, and whose legacy Ramesses was determined to honor, extend, and, inevitably, surpass. The surpassing was comprehensive. Ramesses built more, conquered more, ruled longer, and produced more progeny than his father. But he never matched the artistic quality of the Abydos reliefs. The relief program that Ramesses executed at Abu Simbel, at Karnak, at the Ramesseum, and at his other temples is impressive in its scale and its ambition. But it is not the equal of Seti's work at Abydos in its refinement, its delicacy, or its emotional depth. The father's art was intimate, the son's art was imperial, and the two together, the intimate and the imperial, the whisper and the shout, the finest raised relief and the most colossal sunk relief, constitute the artistic legacy of the 19th dynasty. The discovery of Seti I's tomb in the Valley of the Kings, designated KV-17, discovered by Giovanni Battista Belzoni in 1817, provided a parallel to the artistic achievement of the Abydos temple. The tomb, the longest and deepest in the Valley of the Kings at the time of its discovery, is decorated with reliefs and paintings of exceptional quality. Scenes from the Book of the Dead, the Book of Gates, and other funerary texts, rendered in a style that is recognizably the same as the style of the Abydos reliefs. The tomb and the temple share the same artistic DNA, the same sensitivity to the human form, the same refinement of surface treatment, the same spiritual intensity that distinguishes Seti's art from the art of every other pharaoh. The tomb has suffered more damage than the temple. Its painted surfaces have been affected by moisture, by tourism, and by the removal of several wall sections by early excavators. But enough survives to demonstrate the consistency of Seti's artistic program. A program that extended from the temple at Abydos to the tomb in the Valley of the Kings, from the world of the living to the world of the dead, from the public space of the temple to the private space of the burial chamber. The artistic quality was not limited to the public monument. It extended to the most private and most sacred space of all, the room where the pharaoh would rest for eternity, the chamber where the finest art would be seen only by the gods and the dead. The Temple of Seti I at Abydos stands today as the most eloquent testimony to the artistic ambition of the 19th dynasty and to the capacity of Egyptian art to achieve, within the constraints of a tradition that prized conformity above all other artistic values, a level of beauty that transcends the tradition and speaks, across 32 centuries, to anyone who sees it. The temple is not merely a historical document. It is not merely an archaeological site. It is not merely a tourist attraction. It is a masterpiece. A work of art that deserves to be ranked alongside the greatest artistic achievements of any civilization, that demonstrates the heights that anonymous craftsmen could reach when they were given the finest materials, the finest tools, and the finest patron, and that endures. In its limestone walls, in its corbelled chapels, in the dim light of its hypostyle hall, in the changing shadows of its raised reliefs, as the most beautiful building in the most sacred city in the Nile Valley. The beauty endures, the argument endures, the temple endures, and the reliefs, the finest raised reliefs in the history of Egyptian art, endure with them, carved in white limestone, raised above the surface, catching the light, releasing the shadow, speaking, in the language of light and stone, the language that transcends language, the language that Seti's anonymous masters spoke 3,200 years ago, and that the stone, patient and permanent, still speaks today. So what is the Mortuary Temple of Seti I at Abydos? It is the most beautiful temple in Egypt, a building whose raised reliefs represent the highest achievement of Egyptian artistic tradition. It was built between 1290 and 1279 BC by a pharaoh who needed to establish the legitimacy of a new dynasty, and who chose the most sacred site in Egypt, the most refined art in Egypt, and the most comprehensive theological program in Egypt to accomplish that goal. It is dedicated to 7 gods: Osiris, Isis, Horus, Amun-Ra, Ra-Horakhti-Ptah, and the deified Seti himself, each one housed in a separate chapel, each one served by a separate ritual, each one contributing to a cosmic network of divine service that placed the pharaoh at the center of the universe. Its walls contain the Abydos King List, 76 names, carved in 3 rows, representing Seti's curated history of Egyptian kingship. The list includes every pharaoh that Seti considered legitimate. It excludes every pharaoh that he considered heretical, illegitimate, or politically inconvenient. The list is simultaneously a historical document and a political weapon, a tool for establishing dynastic legitimacy, carved in limestone on the wall of the temple that was designed to secure the pharaoh's place among the gods. Behind the temple lies the Osirian, the mysterious underground structure built from massive granite blocks, filled with groundwater, designed to simulate the primordial island from which the world emerged. The Osirion is the symbolic tomb of Osiris, the place where the god of the dead resides, the threshold of the underworld, the gateway through which the deceased pharaoh passes on his journey from the world of the living to the world of the dead. And the reliefs that have made this temple famous. The raised limestone surfaces where Seti stands before the gods, pouring libations, presenting offerings, receiving blessings, with a grace and a beauty that has not been equaled in 3,000 years of Egyptian art. The reliefs are the temple's true legacy, not the political message they were designed to deliver, which has been superseded by history, but the artistic quality with which they deliver it, which has not been superseded by anything. The political purpose is dead, the art endures, the propaganda has expired, the beauty persists. And the temple, standing in the low desert at Abydos, 3 hours north of Luxor, far from the tourist circuits, far from the cruise ships, far from the crowds that fill Karnak and the Valley of the Kings, holds the beauty in its limestone walls, in its corbelled chapels, in the dim light of its hypostyle hall, waiting for the visitor who makes the journey and who stands, as Seti stood, before the gods. In silence, in the cool air, in the presence of art so perfect that it feels not like stone, but like prayer. The prayer endures, the stone endures, the beauty endures. And the temple, the most beautiful temple in Egypt, the spiritual heart of the most ancient sacred city in the Nile Valley, the house of the pharaoh who needed the gods more than any pharaoh before him, and who won their endorsement through the most exquisite art ever carved in Egyptian stone, endures with them